Welcome to Nell and Matt's Obsolete Movies, the podcast where we revisit films from our 20-plus years of collecting movies on obsolete formats. You can also think of it as, or this podcast as being about films from the VHS era, though not necessarily on VHS. And our film for this episode is A Shot in the Dark from 1964, and we watched it on laserdisc, getting it from John, one of the co-owners of Pleasant Dreams Records. It was given to me actually for free. I bought a speaker cabinet off of John. And when you are a person who collects obsolete formats, sometimes people will just give you media on obsolete formats. Even people who sell you the media on obsolete formats will just kind of say, hey, and here's a box of laser discs. Yeah. That I don't think are sellable in my store. Enjoy. And
that's how we got it. Yep.
That's how we got it. And
and this Laserdisc is a little finicky, so it does sometimes.
Our Laserdisc player is finicky.
Finicky, sorry. Yes.
Yes. This Laserdisc actually worked fine.
Yes.
Unlike the episode we tried to do on Grease.
Yeah.
Which led us to this. So, Shot in the Dark is a Pink Panther film starring Peter Sellers as, of course, Inspector Clouseau, the bumbling yet strangely brilliant French detective.
Yeah.
And there is a murder, and he tries to solve it, and because he's so bad at everything, a bunch more people get killed, but then all the murderers get killed, and falls in love with the initial first suspect of the murder, and wackiness and hilarity sort of ensues. That's A Shot in the Dark.
And it's also the second in the series of the Pink.
Oh, it's
Pink
only the second one. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
This film also, I would say, is a testament to the role of unsupervised time with HBO had, I think, in both of our lives. I remembered a few scenes in this film. I remember as a child when they were on HBO thinking that Pink Panther movies were cool. I think because the world of sophisticated adults seemed so less threatening in these films because everybody was kind of stupid and inept.
Well,
and so the world of manners and nightclubs and going out and being formal and having authority, really, even if I didn't get most of the jokes and couldn't follow the plot, I remember as a very young child, I'm talking 4, 5, 6 years old, loving this movie and other Pink Panther movies.
Well, I think as kids, it's all about his pratfalls, right, and being bumbling, and what kid doesn't love to see those type of things. I mean, this is pre-Fail Army and, that home video series where you can...
America's Funniest Home Videos.
This is you
Pre-Jackass.
Pre-Jackass, so you weren't able to jump on a computer and see somebody take a spill or a fall.
Yes, and things like Buster Keaton and the Three Stooges. That was too old. I mean, we found that actually later in life.
Yeah.
What HBO was presenting to me as a 4-year-old.
Yes.
Was Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau.
The scenes of Kato attacking him, his servant, Kato, attacking...
His very Asian stereotype servant, Kato, attacking him.
But as a kid, you're like, oh, that's so funny. He surprised him in the shower.
Yes.
That seems really funny at the time.
Yes.
I don't know if I find it as funny as an adult, though.
Yes, I think that's, all right, let's just do it. Revisiting the movie in the 2020s, which is the real point, I think, of this podcast.
Yes.
I think the first thing being, though we do have to talk about the ethnic stereotypes in the film, what does it mean for a comedy to be a parody of a basically dead genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is Agatha Christie, so they're taking on Agatha Christie kind of things.
Yes, Clouseau is the dark side of Poirot or something,
Right.
It's also the opening sequence of this film is straight out of Rear Window.
Yeah.
Is an homage to Rear Window. But Hitchcock ain't making Rear Window in the 2020s anymore, and there's not necessarily those types of films that I dare say there are other cultural references or allusions, jokes of allusions throughout this film that we just don't get because we've seen Rear Window.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's the opening sequence of Rear Window. I see what they did there.
And, for me, like, the ending is straight up an Agatha Christie ending, right?
Yes.
And so, so you're right. So these are kind of not in our conscious as much anymore.
No, I guess for people who watch PBS.
Yeah.
On Sunday nights or something.
And I think, not that, like, murder mysteries aren't still a thing, but it's like the pacing is different.
It's
the
very
genre
different.
is different.
It's CGI. It's not a heroic genius.
Right.
Seeing what no one else does. Which the Clouseau character absolutely plays off of.
Yeah, we didn't watch Knives Out, but I guess probably Knives Out would be the most current kind of type of film that we're referencing, where it is a person coming to an investigator investigating a murder. But, this is very much like Agatha Christie, and in some ways, like, the pacing is almost like an Agatha Christie, where for Agatha Christie, it is about the slow burn and gathering the clues and, like...
sniffing out the red herring.
Listening for, one false statement or something like that, which takes time. And so, but it's not necessarily very intriguing in many ways with that time. And so also for this, it also feels like it's the setup of the pratfall.
Yes.
And so kind of like the time between the pratfall isn't always interesting or fun. Or the times between the jokes.
Yes. And also, the trope of the bumbling detective. Because, TV had Columbo.
Yeah.
And... Thomas Pynchon, actually, from the 60s, had, characters. Even the dude from The Big Lebowski, it's like, that's almost sort of a meta, bumbling detective who just happens to figure it all out, even though he's quite bad at life.
Well, even Inspector Clouseau, Inspector Gadget, right?
Inspector Gadget is definitely an homage to Peter Sellers.
Yeah, as a kid, like, Gen Xers growing up, we watched Inspector... we watched Inspector Gadget, which, being like a 30-minute cartoon, works much better than a 2-hour movie.
With, a guy who has a magic suit and could do anything, and technology, and it's really Penny and the dog who kind of figures everything out for him, and he just kind of waltzes through.
Yeah.
But, his hat turns into a helicopter when he needs it in the worst possible way. So... that's in that way, it's the tool belt from Batman meets Inspector Clouseau was that show.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think that was priming the pump already, sort of a visual vocabulary when Inspector Gadget came along.
And I think also too, like the so you would have had at the time Martin and Lewis, right?
Yes.
Which kind of like
later. So this is 64.
This is 64.
So Laughing had not happened yet.
Not Martin. Dean Martin and Jerry.
Dean Martin and Jerry. Oh, I was thinking Rowan and Martin. I was thinking, But you know what? Again, that was 60s comedy.
That was 60s comedy.
That very much had some of the same flavor. There was a physicality, but also laughing at authority.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I think that's interesting for me about Inspector Clouseau is that, like, the commander is actually more bumbling and more inept.
Yeah.
And more, like, the higher up you go on the chain of command, the more strange and inept people become.
Yes. And they're... just because you have more power doesn't mean you're better at
Yes, the commander, accidentally chops his thumb off using his guillotine cigar cutter, and stabs himself, and eventually spoiler alert, kills all the murderers because he goes to blow up Inspector Clouseau's Mini, which I think it's also fitting that Mr. Bean drives a Mini.
Yeah.
He goes to blow up Inspector Clouseau's Mini and actually ends up taking out all of the murderers.
Yeah. So I think, right, that So I bring up Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis because this type of humor, the kind of like falling and getting hurt and those type of things, was very popular in the 60s. Dare I say, though, was Jerry Lewis slightly better at it? I don't know.
Jerry Lewis was a lot better at it. Though it's interesting, as we're watching this film and doing research on it,
yeah,
the way that in his time, Peter Sellers was seen as the contemporary to Chaplin. Back when Chaplin was the best of the silent film comedians. And Chaplin, Keaton, and Harold Lloyd always kind of do this weird thing where every couple of decades the top guy gets replaced. And I think Harold Lloyd is about to launch from third place to first place. For the longest time it was Chaplin.
Yeah,
and then Lloyd, and then Keaton kind of rose the ranks. And by the time I was in graduate school and studying silent film, Keaton was seen as the greatest silent film comic. And there's a very active Buster Keaton society that promotes him. But, Harold Lloyd is starting, I think, to get some attention again, which is interesting. But Peter Sellers was seen as the Chaplin of his era.
Yeah.
And maybe a comedic genius, only second to Chaplin.
And that's not to say that I don't think Peter Sellers is a comedic genius, right? Like, I think he can be such an amazing actor. Like, in Lolita, he's amazing in Lolita. And even The Party's interesting, right? Like, that's, like, an interesting film. For me, I think this kind of... this is definitely a film of its era, but, like, literally a chambermaid, a dead man is found in her bedroom. So Maria. There's a dead man in the bedroom... And Peter Sellers, Clouseau, shows up to investigate. And honestly, he automatically thinks she's innocent because she's hot.
Yes.
And that's it. And that's like the whole premise of this film is that she's too sexy to be a killer.
Yes.
And so he goes around, out of his way to try to prove that she's innocent because he is attracted to her.
Very attracted to her.
Even to the tune of releasing her from jail multiple times because...
Even as more people are dying.
And so literally that's the premise of the film. And so other people are dying, but you actually don't get a good job. So like if it was an Alfred Hitchcock, the kind of search for the killer would have been a bit more interesting. And so the search for the killer, like... For me, the search for the killer is like maybe the fourth interest of this film.
Yes.
And so it's really about like the attractive chambermaid Maria and how cute she is, and Clouseau trying to, have a relationship with her. And then of course all the jokes and him being bumbling is like the other big thing, and his pratfalls. Oh, and then maybe we'll get around to the solving the crime at some point in time.
Yes.
And so I get it, like you get it, but it's kind of like, for me the ending was just like, they just kind of threw it together. Yeah. So it's definitely a film.
There is the ballroom scene, the sort of classic ballroom scene.
Yes, that's true. I mean, if you saw Clue, Clue definitely borrowed a lot of that ballroom scene from the Shot in the Dark, right?
Well, from Shot in the Dark, from also, in a way, if you all the way go back to, like, Ibsen, every Ibsen, quote, well-made play has a ballroom scene.
Gotcha.
Where every main character or every relevant character is, for some reason, it's Thanksgiving and they're all in the same space together.
Well, and that's also an Agatha Christie, too, right?
That is an Agatha Christie. So that goes back to sort of 19th century theater. That kind of sticks with us and becomes a very good trope for the big confrontation at the end when the inspector knows who the killer is, or in this case is trying to figure out who the killer is through this big reveal.
Yeah, I also wish there was, because there are like Seller movies that are much smarter about class, right? And so it is a wealthy, the murder happens at a very wealthy, influential man's home. And so the joke is that forces push for Clouseau to be the inspector because everyone knows he's going to mess it up.
Yeah.
And so, the commissioner, Dreyfus, who you mentioned, is actually more bumbling, caves to pressure, puts Clouseau on it, but doesn't, is just like then terrified of Clouseau messing
and is having a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
Which, mental illness is funny. I think the other thing about this is, too, the stereotype about the French, or the two stereotypes about the French.
Yeah.
Oversexed and bumbling.
Yes.
Oversexed and clumsy, snooty, and, just inept and incapable of basic human adulting.
Yeah.
And I think that's also fascinating and fascinatingly dated.
I agree with you.
It's like, honestly, like, you think there was a time coming out of the 19th century, really the American Revolution and into the 19th century, where there was Americans who were Anglophiles and Americans, who were Francophiles. And, what do we want to be like? Do we want to be like the British, who was the nation who birthed us? Do we want to be like the French? They were around too, and, they helped us out. Liberty, equality, fraternity, all that. They even had their own democratic revolution. And so there was a time, and, Julie Child comes into this too, where French cooking and French things and French art. And we don't care, I think, enough about the French anymore to even for them to even warrant stereotypes anymore. Like, there's just profound indifference about the French.
Yeah.
And that's another way that this film really belongs to a world that no longer exists.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that we, being the generation that has sort of bridged the gap between those worlds, I don't know how younger people would see this movie.
Yeah.
Or would have any interest in seeing this movie.
No. And I think, like, comedy is so much different now. Like,
yes.
Films are so much like, I was thinking about, like, Zoolander, for example. And just
which there are elements of.
Yeah. But I think about, like, the pacing and the humor.
Yes.
And it's just, like, much different for Zoolander. Like, Zoolander is a fun popcorn movie, right? It's just, like, fun to sit and watch that film. This one, I was actually kind of bored and got disinterested in it with it. And the funny thing is, like, so when the screenwriter came up, I was like, that's the dude from The Exorcist. So William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, was one of the screenwriters on this film, which is, like, so weird to me.
That's a very interesting combination.
It is a very interesting combination. And then Blake Edwards, who was married to Julie Andrews, but he did Breakfast at Tiffany's. And so, he was very, like, I remember growing up because I was really watched into, like, TMC and Turner Movie Classic and AMC. So, his stuff was out all the time because he did Breakfast at Tiffany's and Day of Wine and Roses, The Great Race, The Party, and Victor Victoria with his wife and SOB. And so he did a lot of these kind of very famous films. But most of his career, a good chunk of his career, was doing these Pink Panther films.
Yes.
And there ended up being like 10 in total because there was like a reboot. I forgot there was a reboot with Steve Martin at one point.
There was a reboot with Steve Martin. There was also, after Peter Sellers died, a clip movie of like of all the unused footage that they just kind of randomly tried to splice together, which came out in 1982, which explains why I was probably watching this movie when I was 5.
Yeah, that's true.
If there was a new Pink Panther movie, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, oh my gosh, they had, what's his face, who did, he was the French comedic actor who had a little bit of a career for a period of time, and his name, of course, just went out my head.
Jacques Tatier?
No. He, Roberto Benigni, or he's Italian. He did it as well. He did Son of the Pink Panther. I don't know, it was Blake Edwards who still did that, so that was pretty late in his career that he did that. So, I mean, this was, like, there's a ton of these. I think some failed at the box office, but in total, I think it was a very successful franchise. I think it made almost $500 million with it.
Yes.
But I do think it's more of people wanting to see the jokes than seeing him.
Yeah, and well, it is a comedy, and I mean, it does say on the laserdisc sleeve that this was one of the funniest of the Pink Panther movies.
Oh.
So I wonder. It does make me wonder what a bad Pink Panther movie
would look like
in 2023. Yeah, I've kind of kicked this around a bit. I think the other thing is we've talked about this for 20 minutes. I don't know if there's anything else to talk about in this film. So should we get to the 5 big questions?
I think so.
Well, first one, and I think we've already reached this answer, is a camp retro classic or just an old movie?
I think it's just an old movie.
Yeah.
To be honest with you. It's of its time. I'd rather watch Doctor Strangelove or Lolita if I'm feeling, or even The Party.
Or Being There. I think we should watch
There.
Being There at some point. We do own that on an obsolete format. I forget which one, but we do own it. We should watch that at some point. Which also, I think we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I do want to get into it a little bit. Question 2, the social political distance. Mental health is funny.
Yeah.
Ethnic people are funny.
Yes.
And women don't have agency.
Exactly.
3 pillars of this film. There is no plot without the fact that, the one person who was killed was a Spaniard and he was super passionate and he ripped the chambermaid's clothes off and she was quite enjoying that.
Yeah.
But because he was a Spaniard, it makes sense that he would be that heated and incapable of controlling his passions.
Yes.
Again, Kato, as the Asian stereotype, he's the manservant, but he's also he's in a subjective role, and also then he's kung fu, and he knows.
He doesn't speak either.
No, he does. He answers the phone.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
He says he can stop at the Clouseau residence, and then
that's it. And
then once the fight is over, then Inspector Clouseau gives him a smackdown, because once he stops fighting, then he can be beaten. Yeah, and of course, like I said, the whole thing about the French. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the weird, definitely a weirdness around it.
Yeah.
And I agree with you 100% with the women and agency, and then also, so the murder all happened related to a bunch of different people sleeping with each other. So even like the sexual politics are kind of weird in it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about the technical distance, especially the effects? I think you mentioned it a couple times. I think the pacing of the film is really what dates it in terms of like the mechanics of movie making.
Yeah.
There really are no special effects. I mean, there's stunts. There are practical stunts.
Yeah.
How many times does Peter Sellers fall out of a second-story window?
Yeah.
Or fall into the water fountain at the estate?
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
He does that a lot. And so they're all practical effects and very physical humor.
Yeah.
So that stays, but yeah, I think the pacing is what's... And I love, there's a bunch of great old weird French cars.
I was just going to say that the car casting for it is pretty...
The car casting is pretty epic. There's Renaults cool. and
the police van is
and the police van is a Citroën, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the car casting is fantastic.
Yeah, watch it for the cars. There's no car chases. But...
And there is also this like silly gag. I think they only do it twice where... He's trying to trail Maria as she's leaving. And so the first time he's a balloon seller but gets busted.
The second time he's a painter. He gets busted, yeah.
Yeah, and
then he gets busted a few other times.
Yeah. So there's like these kind of weird things of like this like gag that doesn't necessarily go anywhere.
Yes.
And then also there's that
acts as a refrain.
Yeah.
Which is also weird. The undercover cop gets arrested and can't produce a badge or an ID,
and of course it feels like every like 60s sitcom comedy had to have a nudist colony.
Scene, yes.
And so,
which
of course,
there is that.
He ends up at a nudist colony, but he does a pretty good job of covering himself.
Yes.
But yeah, so there's just these kind of, we keep saying it, like the pacing's weird and of its time kind of jokes.
Yeah.
And so even him, like, between these kind of things that are happening, even like his reasoning isn't necessarily there of why he so believes in her, or he I know it's a part of the joke that he's bumbling, but there's not even like these really interesting kind of him putting things together kind of moments.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the new question 4, what does it mean to watch it on this format? What does it mean to watch Pink Panther Laserdisc? Other than the fact that we tried for 40 minutes to make Grease Laserdisc work. Apparently sometimes Laserdiscs start to separate.
Oh, interesting.
And so actually when they start to separate, they become unreadable.
Oh. And
so we were trying to get... And also... it had been dropped or something, this Grease. So we actually put Shot in the Dark in to just test to see if it was the player or the disc, and the disc booted right up, and so
So there's always this like nostalgia. So when the United Artists came up, the UA.
Yes.
And so for me as a kid, I always felt like United Artists was prestige films.
Yes.
So hearing that music and seeing that logo, I was like, like in my mind, I was like, oh, United Artists, and it has to be something, it's prestigious.
Yes.
Meanwhile, it's a Shot in the Dark.
Yes. And also, when was the last time you saw a movie on any home video format that had a cigarette burn in it?
Oh, yeah. That is true.
And not a cigarette burn as in somebody, burned it with a cigarette, but the sign that it was time to switch reels in the theater.
Yeah.
I did notice that at least once. Actually, at the end of side A of the Laserdisc, I was like, oh, that's a cigarette burn. I remember when those were in movies all the time when you watch them in theaters and on TV and on VHS and apparently on Laserdiscs.
And so with a Laserdisc, you do have to flip it.
Yeah.
So, like a VHS and DVD, you don't, but for laser...
Or streaming, for that matter.
Streaming. So that's also a thing, like, it's like if you do get into a film, you do have to stop, get up, flip it over, and then, so that kind of...
And hopefully that the second side reads.
It reads, and sometimes they're not always great about when to cut the action.
This one worked really well.
Yeah.
This one worked at a jump cut. The fidelity is not great. Again, we're Laserdisc to a now 15-year-old 1080p flat screen TV.
I can only imagine how it would look if we had a brand new TV.
Yeah, if we had a brand new TV, I bet if we had an old cathode ray, our old living room TV that died 15 years ago, it would probably look pretty good.
Yeah.
But, this is a grainy print that they made this Laserdisc off of as well. So this is, pretty far from 4K restoration.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, over time, you kind of stop noticing the graininess.
Yes, you
just
sort of
kind
stop
adjust
noticing. The night scene was very odd.
Yeah.
They used diffusion. Or, I don't think they used diffusion, actually. I think they just used very low lighting. And, again, you're supposed to be sort of maybe drawn in. But these people moving across this grand house, and then there's gunfire. And, but then again, also, is this a film that would ever get a 1080p restoration?
Right.
And so it also is a question of becoming, if you don't collect these sorts of things, at what point do you maybe lose the ability to see them?
Right.
Not that this is a particularly important film, but it's a film human beings made, and and attention must be paid, like Willy Loman.
There's that thing of attention should be paid. So I do think not that we're hoarders, because that's what it's going to come off as being hoarders, but I do think there is a value into having access to what people have made in the past.
Absolutely. And, every school, university I've been affiliated with is just purging library books left and right. And granted, young people are not at all interested in reading paper.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of knowledge that's going out the door.
Yeah.
And I think there's also ways in which... I think part of why we do this podcast, too, is that, streaming does have the illusion of infinite choice.
Right.
But actually, things come and go.
As we all learned with the U2 and the situation where Apple could just put something on your phone for you.
They could also just take it off,
and
like with the George Orwell book. Or
yeah.
I also tell this story, and I probably have told this story on this podcast before. I had set up my teaching and film course, and I had found a bunch of stuff that was on Hulu and Netflix. And it was a spring class, and so in December I thought I'd be savvy, and maybe even before, it might have even been before Christmas or before New Year's. I was between Christmas and New Year's. I got my syllabus together, looking at things that were on these readily available streaming services that my students wouldn't have to pay to see these movies. They could borrow a password if they didn't already have one. And January 1st, 8 of the 10 films that I had chosen on those two formats went off of streaming.
Right. Yeah.
Or at least free streaming. Students were still able to find ways to see them.
Yeah.
But for a couple people, the easiest way was to go to the library where they had a DVD and then sit at a library computer that still had a disk drive, because their laptops did not.
Yeah.
And that was the easiest way to see some of those films for that course.
Yeah.
Which people told me they just sort of built it into their weekend. But again, it's if things go away and eventually, it's some of these servers, it's just not going to be profitable to keep them turned on. And so things will sort of disappear, and things will disappear from public memory.
Well, also we also don't talk a lot about digital decay, right? So there will be a part in time where there's just not going to be enough space to hold. Yeah,
those legacy box commercials really offend me, because they're like, get rid of these physical things. You'll have safe digital media that'll last maybe 5 to 6 years. But actually, if you keep those photographs and keep those VHS tapes and keep those film strips in a cool, dry place, they might be around 100 years from now, whereas the thing that you pay for... there will at some point be a Windows or Mac OS upgrade that you will not be able to get to them anymore.
Exactly. And also, I think about silent films too, where a lot of films. I mean,
75%.
75%. I mean, there's the famous scene in Gone with the Wind. The fire was set using old film.
Old nitrite film. Yeah.
And so there's so much film that was lost, and so many things that we can't see.
So it is important to hold on to things, even if they're not necessarily good things.
Right.
Which I guess then is the fifth question. Will we ever actually watch this Laserdisc again? That might start separating. Will be unplayable at some point as well. Or, I keep thinking about that we need to start stockpiling more machines.
So, I know, right. So I could see me saying I want to see the first one again, Pink Panther. I could see saying like, oh, we should watch Pink Panther, the first one. I don't think I'd want to see A Shot in the Dark again, to be honest with you.
I think the only circumstance which I would be in another 40 years, and I'm suffering from a precipitous cognitive decline. And that kind of humor and that kind of pacing is something I can handle.
Yeah.
I think that could happen.
Yeah.
But those are the circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, I'd rather watch Buster Keaton for this type of stuff.
Absolutely. I'd rather watch Buster Keaton, Jackass, Harold Lloyd, Charles Chaplin.
Right. I'd rather watch them because, also oddly for Buster Keaton, I feel like his pacing is much better too.
Yes.
And he actually, the coherence in the story is much better.
For some of them. A film like The General, where there was money involved, but a lot of the Buster Keaton independent films, which is the ones he's remembered for, there was no plot. There was no storyboard even. There was no script and no storyboard. And sometimes he would, I'm putting scare quotes here, write the film scene to scene.
Yeah.
And instead of shooting, you got, 4 scenes downtown, 3 scenes at the house, and 1 scene on a boat. They'd start at the house, go downtown, go to the boat, and say, you know what, I think I know what should have happened downtown. Let's go back to downtown and shoot that sequence. And then let's go back to the boat. And then let's go back to the house. And so when his ex-brother-in-law sold his contract to MGM, and they were like, what? What do you mean you don't have a shooting script? What do you mean there's not a schedule for things? So a lot of his films do kind of go off the rails because he would keep thinking of funny, Our Hospitality and the bit with the train.
Yeah.
He would keep thinking of ways of making a joke in the train. Oh, it's another funny thing we can make a train do. And here's another, you know what else would be funny with this train if the wheels fall off? Which, not if you're in East Palestine, Ohio. But, and so the film kind of like breaks down in terms of plot and pacing and all of it.
Yeah.
And then there's a gag, the dog is following the train, and then he gets to and all the times the train breaks, and he never notices that the dog's hanging around, and then he gets there, and you're like, what's my dog doing here? Like, all of those things. So he does that, too. He does sacrifice plot, coherence, and pacing for jokes. Which is also maybe a thing, I guess you look at, like, some of the Will Ferrell, John C. Reilly improv comedies. I mean, basically movies like Semi-Pro and Step Brothers and Ricky Bobby, Talladega Nights. A lot of those were improv, and sort of it was the editor's job, but you had an editor who had a really strong sense of, this is how the best joke from Semi-Pro is a line Amy Sedaris says that's not even in the film. That scene isn't even in the film.
Yeah. Because
though it's the best joke, they can't put that extra 90 seconds in the film to set up that joke. Whereas a film like this that's got a runtime of 1 hour and 10 minutes.
It was 2 hours and 10 minutes, was it?
No, I'm sorry. It was 10 minutes short. It's 110 minutes, sorry. Yeah. An hour is 60 minutes. 110 minute runtime, so just shy of 2 hours. I think for the sake of all of the times that he needs to fall out that window.
Yeah. So if you want a broad comedy, go see Talladega Nights. That's really fun. Or go see Zoolander. This, if you want a Peter Sellers film, there's a ton of better Peter Sellers films. Yeah. So I don't think I would watch this again.
And if you want really strong physical comedy, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and Charlie Chaplin.
And Jackass.
Yeah.
Those are all much, much better films to go see.
So I think that's about it.
Bye.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.